This video, it's made possible by World of Warships. It's the thinking man's action game. Stay tuned because I give it a try at the end of this video. But if you do want to get started right now, make sure you check out the link to the game in the description box below. Loads of free perks for the first 300 viewers who click that. And also, going through that link, well, it helps support this show. So, Today I Found Out, we like to answer our viewer questions, and today we're answering a really important one because Holly H asks, I was watching an episode of Grey's Anatomy, and in one episode a guy is hit by a bazooka and the bomb gets lodged inside his body without exploding. Has this ever happened in real life? Well, Holly, good news. Here we go. At first thought, the idea of a human being hit by some kind of large explosive that not only doesn't detonate and kill the person, but then somehow becomes lodged inside their body, necessitating its removal via surgery, seems like the invention of some hack Hollywood writer somewhere. However, while rare, the situation is something that has happened a surprising number of times. Now, as you may have already guessed, cases of unexploded ordnance becoming lodged inside of human beings is limited almost exclusively to military personnel. In fact, according to a 1999 study of 36 instances of this exact trauma, it is described as a uniquely military injury, with it being additionally noted that there were, at the time the paper was written, no known cases of something similar occurring in civilian life. That said, during our own research, we did find a handful of cases of non-military personnel sustaining an injury that resulted in an explosive becoming lodged inside their body. Going back to the military though, by far the most common weapon to cause such an injury is the M79 grenade launcher, which according to the aforementioned study was responsible for 18 of the 36 injuries discussed therein. Further, according to the fittingly titled paper, Stratification of Risk to the Surgical Team in Removal of Small Arms Ammunition Implanted in the Craniofacial Region, small munitions such as certain types of armor-piercing and tracer rounds can occasionally ricochet and become lodged inside a person without the explosive innards going off. In such a case as this, removal of the round is of paramount importance, and the surgical team is noted as being in extreme peril in doing the procedure. And do note here that contrary to popular belief and Hollywood depictions, in most cases it's absolutely safer to leave regular bullets and the like inside the body rather than trying to get them out. Of course, in what we're talking about today, the thing inside the body is explosive, so it's a really different matter. Okay, so let's go back to grenades and the like. Amazingly, while you'd think something like having a large explosive lodged somewhere in your body would be a surefire recipe for an untimely and rather messy death, fatalities from this particular kind of injury are surprisingly rare. For example, according to the first study quoted in this piece, of the 36 known cases from World War II to the modern day, there were only 4 fatalities, which is about 11%. Even more important here is that all 4 died before surgery could be attempted, owing to the injuries being especially severe, with half being hit in the face and the other 2 being struck by rocket launchers. And look, whatever way you slice it, this is not exactly the kind of injury that you're going to expect a person to walk off, whether the explosive went off or not. Nevertheless, stories of soldiers surviving even these kind of injuries exist. For example, considering the case of one Private Channing Moss, who was hit by a baseball-sized bat rocket-propelled grenade that buried itself in his abdomen almost completely through from one side to the other, with part of the device still sticking out, he totally survived. Then you have the story of Jose Luna, a Colombian soldier who was accidentally shot in the face by a grenade launcher and was up and walking around after several rounds of surgery to remove it and repair the damage as best as possible. Perhaps the most impressive thing about the literature we consulted is that in every case where a patient with unexploded munitions inside their body was able to make it to surgery, the surgical team were able to remove the explosive without it exploding, and they further went on to survive. In fact, according to the aforementioned study covering the 36 known cases, there wasn't a single one where the explosive in question detonated during transportation, preparation, or removal. A factor that almost certainly influences this statistic is that explosive ordnance disposal experts are often on hand to offer advice before and during the surgery. On top of this, from the moment a foreign object inside of a person's body is identified as an explosive, multiple steps are taken to reduce the likelihood of it detonating. These measures include things like keeping the patient as still as possible and limiting the use of electronic or heating devices during a surgery. In addition, to protect the surgical team and others should the worst happen, the surgery to remove an explosive is usually, if time and circumstances allow it, conducted away from people in an area designed to absorb the damage from the explosion. Surgeons are often also given protective equipment, though some choose to forego it as it can impede their fine motor skills, which particularly need to be on form when removing undetonated explosives and operating on individuals who are severely wounded to boot. We can also assume that these surgeons are also encumbered by the giant size and density of the balls and ovaries that they must have, giving their willingness to operate on a patient who might explode at any second. On a related note, official US Army policy states that any soldier suspected of having unexploded ordnance in their body are not supposed to be transported for medical treatment, as the risk of the ordnance exploding and killing the other soldiers is considered too great. However, this rule is seemingly universally ignored in the rare event that such a scenario occurs. As one Staff Sergeant Dan Brown so eloquently put it when discussing the aforementioned case of Private Channing Moss, who had an explosive in him powerful enough to kill anything within 30 feet of him: he was American, he was a soldier, he was a brother, and he was one of us. And there was nothing going to stop us from doing what we had to do. Thus, the soldiers involved carefully bandaged his giant wound and chose not to inform their superiors of his exact condition in case they'd ordered them to follow the aforementioned rule. Instead, they just reported he had a severe shrapnel injury. The soldiers then carried him to an extraction point while under heavy fire for part of the time. The crew that then airlifted the soldiers was made aware of the situation and likewise agreed that they weren't going to leave Channing behind, as the rules stated should be done, even though it would have meant all of their deaths if the device had exploded mid-flight. Once back at base, there was no time to set up an isolated medical station to get Channing away from the rest of the wounded, as he was in critical condition as it was. So they just operated right away, including having to deal with the fact that at one point Channing's heart stopped mid-surgery and they were limited on their options to get it going again, given the explosive embedded in his body. In the end, it all worked out, and Channing got to go home to his 6-month pregnant wife and eventually met his daughter Juliana when she was born a few months later. In any event, as discussed right at the start of this video, there are also rare cases of civilians accidentally getting explosive devices stuck inside their bodies, though in all cases it's much less heroic than the military-based events. For example, consider the case of a 44-year-old Texas man who had an unexploded large firework mortar lodge itself inside his right leg after he approached the tube containing the firework, thinking it was a dud, only to have it violently shoot off and embed itself in said appendage. Luckily for him, it did not then explode as it was designed to do. The good news is that everything went well from there, with the surgeons taking the precaution not to use anything electrical or applying any heat during the surgery. So yeah, to answer the question posed at the start of this video, someone having an explosive device surgically removed from their body is not just a Hollywood invention, but does occasionally happen in real life. However, we could not find any known instances of megalomaniacal crime lords embedding explosive devices into their underlings to ensure loyalty and obedience. So that one's on Hollywood. Further, while the occasional terrorist will shove some explosives into one of their orifices, to date these have generally been pretty ineffective, including one case where the explosive device was stuck up the bomber's rectum and he was standing right next to the intended target, Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Nayef. Nayef sustained only minor injuries, while the suicide bomber had his midsection blown to pieces. Naturally, he did not survive. It should also be noted that the often depicted scenario of surgically implanting explosives in such cases, at least thus far, hasn't really been a thing, according to the various counterterrorism agencies out there who've mentioned it as a possibility. This is despite many a media report implying that such a thing does happen. In the end, as a Terrorism Research Center report noted, the procedure involved in surgically embedding in a human body an explosive large enough to do real damage is extremely complex, requiring extensive medical support and expertise, with a high risk to the patient surviving the procedure and then being fit enough to execute the mission. They also note that even then it takes too much time to be worth it when considering the planning and recuperation time after. Thus, at least to date, terrorist organizations have stuck with more conventional methods of suicide bombing. For these reasons, while security experts are attempting to plan for this possibility, to date it's noted that it's not really on the radar yet. That said, one case of a device embedded in humans that sometimes does explode and cause damage is actually pacemakers. It turns out that while rare, these sometimes explode during the cremation of a body that has one. While usually the damage is minimal, in 3% of cases looked at in the paper Pacemaker Explosions in Crematoria, Problems and Possible Solutions published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, the cremator of an structure was destroyed beyond repair by the explosion, including in one case also causing injury to a worker. However, it would appear that this is still a pretty rare event, and in most cases the worst that happens is a loud bang, startling the crematoria employees. So, in World of Warships, you might not be able to embed explosives in other people, disappointing as that may be, but you can embed explosives in your enemy's ships. That was a smooth transition, Simon. Now, before I do these sponsorships, I always test out the merchandise. This one was easier because it's a game and you guys always seem to like it when I play the games, so let's hop over to the computer and do just that.
Alright, this is World of Warships. You've seen me play this before. First of all, I do apologize for the bad audio quality. I have a pretty bad mic on my computer, and it is what it is. I suppose I could use the lav mic, but it's a nightmare to sync up. Anyway, this is World of Warships. It's a game that is completely free to play. They gave me an account, but you do not need to be given an account. You can sign up, and you are ready to go. If you do sign up with our link, you get loads of extra cool free stuff, so do use that. It also does support the show, so that's always appreciated. Alright, how are we doing? Ooh, I'm an American. Yeah, alright. Destroy all enemy ships and capture the base. Look at this thing, it's really nice looking. And what's cool about World of Warships is it's not just a good looking game, it's endless hours of strategy. They totally told me to say that, but it is endless hours of strategy. It's a lot of fun. Okay, I think this is the slower ship, which means I'm probably not going to get my ass handed to me quite as handily as I would if I was playing with, I think it's the HMS Campbelltown, which I think is the free ship that you get using our link. They always kill me in that one. Who am I playing with? Tommy Dingo, Turpitz, and I've been given the very creative nickname Warship Commander 34. Okay, so we can target things like this. Where's the scope? Whoops-a-daisy. There is me. So these guys are engaged in... Wow, that's a lot of fire. Okay, I gotta go get involved. And this is my base. I gotta defend this, but I'm gonna go shoot some guys. That's more fun. Yeah, there's the scope. Shift is the scope. If I fire slightly ahead... Come on, come on! Oh, yes! Yeah, that's the Badger. Alright. Oh, man, Come on, yes! It's always good to make sure I'm not getting horribly shot myself when playing. Let's see... That guy's almost had it. Get out of the way! Or don't, I'll shoot you too. Yes! I am ramming someone. This is not a good time for me. Full reverse. Okay, my ship's basically destroyed, but I'm gonna go after this guy anyway. Nope, I can't shoot through rock. Still can't shoot through rock. Hahaha. So that's World of Warships. It's a lot of fun.
So that was World of Warships. To get started now, make sure you check out the link to the game in the description box below. Loads of free perks for the first 300 viewers who do that. And as always, going through that link does help support this show. And as always, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, etc. And thank you for watching.